Why was Iraq in so many conflicts?
That's a great question, right? There are several different answers that people would give. I mean, people point to colonialism. I don't really think that explains very much. There's a lot of colonial countries. Not all of them were in that sort of that type of conflict. People talk about Iraq as being a kind of artificial state, which is not really true. Iraq is a was there before Western colonists came. At least the Arab sections of Iraq that run up the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. So the Kurdish section was lumped on after World War One, but the other part, Iraq is actually a quite natural geographic entity. Um, so why was it so violent? I mean, part of this, I think, is just there's an ideological component to this. I mean, Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athists, they adopted the worst sorts of European politics, right, from the 1930s, which led to all sorts of death and destruction in Europe too, right? So when you have these ideas floating around of, really hardcore nationalism, right, expansionist political ideologies, that's going to usually lead to some not so pleasant results. But the other reason I think is, you have this combination of this sort of brutal rule, right? Some debates whether it should be called totalitarian or neo-fascist or something like that. But certainly, I think, those are debates for a reason. One might look at that country under Saddam Hussein in the 70s and 80s and think about, similar regimes in Europe. But that on itself probably wasn't enough. People could have just ignored it or put it in its box. When you had this kind of regime and it invades its neighbor, Kuwait, in 1990, it happens at this unique moment in global history where the Cold War is coming to an end, right? The Berlin Wall has come down. In fact, they're negotiating German reunification just as the Iraqis are storming across the border into Kuwait in the summer of 1990. And so people are trying to think about, well, what is this new world going to look like, right? What's going to happen now that we don't have a Cold War? The Soviets and the Americans are cooperating. Europe seems to be unifying. There's tremendous possibilities in the world, right? Even China, even though it didn't happen at the time, there was Tiananmen Square. People sort of thought that maybe it's going in that direction, right? Elsewhere in Africa, you have the apartheid regime, which is falling apart. It seems like things are moving in the right direction, at least for more idealistic statesmen and intellectuals around the world. And then you have this regime in Baghdad, which is torturing people and murdering folks, and it's used chemical weapons not only against its enemies but its own people, and then it invades this sovereign country to its south, Kuwait, and it's just mayhem. They're just raping and pillaging, and we use those words, raping and pillaging, as those that just roll off the tongue in English. But we're talking about real raping and real pillaging, right? I mean, the literal definition of those words. And this is just an affront to this wave of global idealism, and the U.S. decides to make make Iraq into a test case, right? To show the world that sort of politics isn't going to be. Now, there's a lot of hypocrisy in what the U.S. is doing, right? Don't get me wrong. The U.S. isn't some noble. It has a lot of noble characteristics, in my opinion, but it's not it's certainly not perfect, and it has made all sorts of its own mistakes, and it's responsible for its own tragedies. That being said, there were people who thought, I think, realistically or legitimately felt that they could move on to something better, and they decided to make an example out of Iraq, right? To reverse what the Iraqis did in Kuwait, but not just that, to show that they could use certain new tools sanctions, no-fly zones, UN's weapons inspections. There had always been sanctions, right, as a tool of statecraft, but this is something different. This was the entire UN coming. These weren't American sanctions on Iraq, right? They were UN sanctions on Iraq, right? Where the UN comes and says the global community will not stand for this, and according to the rule of law, we're going to impose these sanctions in these no-fly zones and these weapons inspections, and we expect you Iraqis to to come clean about these different aspects of your past. And so they built this entire sort of system partly to contain Iraq, but partly just to show that they could do this, right? That this was a tool in sort of towards world order that could be used in the future. And the real idealists out there, people, and there were some, not necessarily in government, but in NGOs and different humanitarian organizations, were hoping that they could develop something that would be even an alternative to warfare completely. Right? There is that narrative that's going on in the early 1990s. And you have groups like Human Rights Watch, working with like the Defense Intelligence Agency on these the American Defense Intelligence Agency on these shared projects, which is the lion laying down with the lamb, I guess. But so because Iraq is put in this role and it becomes this test case, when things start to not go well, there's just too much at stake, right? The U.S. can't just walk away. And so the U.S. realizes things aren't going well. Its allies realize things aren't going well. You have people start defecting from this idea of holding Iraq responsible, because actually, and these tools turn out to be not so idealistic, right? When you sanction an entire country and it turns out that people have trouble getting medicine and they have trouble getting food, and there's kids dying, who are innocent, and there's all of these innocent people who are suffering, especially if someone like Saddam Hussein in there who doesn't care about the suffering of his own people. He'll just let them rot if it'll put pressure on the U.S. to end the sanctions. So the humanitarian situation in Iraq is getting very bad. There's a sort of just people get tired of the issue of Iraq, and so the coalition starts to fracture at the UN. It's not going the way the U.S. wanted, but the U.S. can't walk away, right? When Somalia went bad, a few people were shot in Mogadishu around the same time. The U.S. just said, "Okay, we're out of here," right? They could, intervene in the Balkans. They could not intervene in the Balkans. There's a lot of geopolitical reasons to do so or not do so, but they weren't trapped in the same way that they were in Iraq. Because if they walk away from Iraq, they're giving up not just on Iraq, but of this entire, at least American politicians. If you read, the transcripts of like the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton was having with Chirac, right? Jacques Chirac, the French president in the late 1990s, and Chirac is saying, "What are we doing here? This isn't making any sense," right? But Clinton would respond, "Okay, but then what happens next if we walk away from this? If we say that Iraq doesn't have to follow these rules, right? The rule of law, then the rule of law means nothing, and we're back to the rule of the jungle," which is, this is the language that they used, right? It's the rule of law versus the rule of the jungle. And we're going to show that the rule of law can work in Iraq. And there's a fear that if they let it slip, that the precedent will be set, that international law means nothing, and we're back to the rule of the jungle, where states just do what they can, right? They take whatever they want, as long, power is the only arbiter.
And after that, Saddam was still ruling. Would you say, I think one of your points was that Saddam was a major, not a catalyst, but a one of the major reasons why Iraq went into trouble again and again and again. Is that just it, or what else is there? I don't. Was really just Saddam's rule the problem?
I mean, listen, it's never just one person, right? But I think he is a big part of it. This is someone who
Yes.
pretty single-handedly, decided to launch two major wars against his neighbors. At least encouraged certain behaviors within his regime, which are quite extreme. with using chemical weapons and stuff like that against your own people.